Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good day everyone. We are from Group The Label. We'll do a presentation on motherhood and female labor supply. So this is our group members and my name is Muhammad Ahmad Firdaus bin Alias. At the first phase of this presentation, I would like to explain a bit of introduction for our topic. In the labor supply, female and male today are fighting for the position and it shows a positive trend when female also want to participate in the labor supply. However, as a nature of human being, female and male, they will into a marriage life. And for female, especially, they will become a mothers after that. So being a mother, there are limitations faced by females or mothers in participate in labor supply after they become a mothers. In the first part of this presentation, Sister Amani and I will discuss few factors that affect mothers to involve into the labor market. The factor will be discussed is the child effect, the heterogeneous impact of motherhood, the role of gender norms, and the provision of childcare. Let's move to the first effect, which is the child effect. First of all, the child effect can be refers to a presence of children in the family. Basically, mother will choose to exit or not participate in the labor supply when they having a baby. The numbers of children and frequency of childbirth also one of the determinant for women, especially mother, to consider when it comes to the participation in labor force. Additionally, women start to decline their interest in participation in the labor supply when they give birth to a child, especially first child. Commitment in managing children become more of their priority than employment. So based on the explanation above, it is not surprisingly when the relationship between mothers in the labor supply and the presence of children have an inverse relationship. So we move to the next point, which is heterogeneous impact on motherhood. In this section, I will discuss on 2 points, which is type of household and education. For the type of household, there are many types and each type is different to each other. Example of household where there are women who stay in the large family consists of her family or his husband family. It is also a type of household where women stay in a small family, and lastly, women who knows as a lone mother, and lone mother is one of the type of household. For this presentation, we will focus on two types, which is large family and lone mother. For lone mother, women basically choose to participate in the labor market since she still need to raising her kid or child. So being a lone mother makes them involved in the labor supply and contribute in the rate of labor force participation rate for female. However, for women stay at or live in the large family, they have two situations. Firstly, they can participate in the labor force if there are other family members can taking care of her child or an old people in that house. But if the second situation, they choose not to involve in the labor supply due to the responsibilities of taking care of the family member. And so for the type of household in which types that women stay can be affected, either they can participate or not in the labor supply. Next point is the education. It refers to the education level. In the education point, the education level that women have is the key of their contribution in the labor supply. For example, for women, even mother who have a degree qualification, they tend to re-enter the labor market after the period of non-participant in paid employment. This is because nowadays female choose the career first compared to being a mother, because they know that being a mother will affect their contribution in the labor supply. And there are some situations where female choose not to marry or willingly to divorce with her husband instead of being a mother and need to let go their career. So I think that's all for me. I pass the button to Sister Amani. Thank you.
In discussing the impact of motherhood on female labour supply, we cannot ignore the role of gender norms. Traditionally, women are assumed to play a central role in family care, while men assume the role of the primary breadwinner. This breadwinner norm, which has been long ingrained in society, continues to impede female labour supply. It was also found that having children actually heightens adherence to such norms, and that having more children results in increased likelihood of women becoming long-time family carers. Society has however progressed, and we are now moving towards a more gender equal or gender egalitarian social values. To illustrate the husband's level of education, which basically denotes how the social norms affect women, has a negative relationship with the social stigma surrounding working women. In this sense, women who have more educated husbands are more likely to participate in the labor force. Secondly is the impact of social norms through social interactions with peers. In this regard, having peers who are more progressive or gender equal actually increases a woman's likelihood to participate in the labour force, and increases the likelihood of also striking a work-life balance. And this can be seen through the influence by the peers, either through the information that they provide or social learning, or even conformism, where women tend to replicate or emulate the decisions as embodied by the peers. And this is especially significant among women with low education, who otherwise would not have basically access to that kind of information. Next is on the provision of childcare. Childcare is a key area in government policies to promote female labour supply. Childcare, whether it be formal or informal, paid or unpaid, can actually mediate between the family responsibilities and the work participation among women, and incentivize women to actually devote more time to work. In this regard, the availability of childcare actually increases women's participation in the labour force, while the childcare costs can actually have a negative relationship with female labour force participation. For instance, when childcare costs increase, women are less likely to participate in the labour force. Studies have shown that the impact of the availability of childcare is actually more significant or more important than the impact of childcare costs on affecting female labour supply, or particularly maternal labour supply. Despite the positive impacts of childcare on female labour force participation, there are also valid concerns that need to be addressed. For instance, a study has shown that the use of childcare services has adverse outcomes on children, which is observed in both behavioral and health aspects. And it can also result in lower quality parental relationships, or where it causes strains between the parents and the children. And this is something that needs to be addressed, and something that mainly concerns the quality of the childcare being provided.
Moving on to the methodology part of our paper, for the first section, data use, the dependent indicator we have chosen is female labor force participation rate, or MLM, which is the proportion of the population ages 15 and older, calculated in percentage, that is economically active, i.e. the people who supply labor for the production of goods and services during a specified period. For the independent indicator, the first one is the role of gender norms, or RGN, which is the ratio of female to male labor force participation rate, which is calculated by dividing female labor force participation rate by male labor force participation rate and multiplied by 100. We have chosen the national estimates of the countries. The third one is for independent indicator is the child effect, or CE. We have chosen the fertility rate, which is the total fertility rate that represents the number of children that will be born to a woman if she were to live to the end of her childbearing years and bear children in accordance with age-specific fertility rates of the specified year, and it is represented under the child effects or presence of child. The data is retrieved from the OECD Data Bank website. And the third one, for the independent indicator, which is child care provision, or CCP, we utilize the data by OECD on public expenditure on childcare services. The data refers to the funding of the government on childcare expenses in percentage of GDP. For the heterogeneous impact of motherhood, due to the lack of macro data availability, this factor is excluded from this study. Moving on to the sources of data. For this paper, we have chosen a cross-sectional data of 30 countries in the year 2012. The sources of data has been retrieved from the World Bank Data Bank and OECD database. All of the data were collected through the World Bank Data Bank and OECD database, which provide secondary data for all the variables that are being used in this paper, which include data for female labor force participation rate, ratio of female to male labor force participation rate, fertility rate, and public expenditure on childcare services. And finally, we have come to the model section of our paper. We have come up with our own multiple regression equation model by using female labor force participation rate as our dependent variables and ratio of female to male labor force participation rate, fertility rate, and public expenditure on childcare services as our independent variable. Below are the multiple regression equation model. As you can see on the left is MLM equals to beta naught plus beta 1 RGN plus beta 2 CE plus beta 3 CCP, and lastly plus the random error term.
So for the data descriptions, we collected data from OECD and also World Bank database, and actually the number of data or sample from for each variable varies. Per se, for one independent variable, we have data from 96 countries, and the other variable we have from 38, and the other countries we have from 56. So the data varies, and as we integrated, data from all countries for all variables, we lose a huge chunk of the data. This is due to the reasons that sometimes from one countries we have data in almost all of the variables, but there's this one variable that we do not have the data for that country, so we have to omit that country out. Hence, from 38 OECD countries in 2022, we only managed to gather the data, complete data for all 4 variables for 30 OECD countries.
I am Nurul Anis Menti Ismail. I will present the data analysis and also findings. So this is how we conduct the test. We use eViews to regress all the data, and this is the result of the regression. MLM is equal to negative 8.122761 plus 0.679559 RGN plus 3.887226 CE plus 2.215264 CCP. And as you can see, this figure displays the result of OLS estimation that we obtained from the eViews. So the first column displays the explanatory variables, or known as independent variables, which included the role of gender norms, the child effect, and how childcare provision affects motherhood and female labor supply participation. Firstly, the estimated coefficient for the role of gender norms implies that mother and female labor supply participation is approximately 0.6795% of the female population aged 15 and above more than male labor supply participation. In other words, the results showed that gender norms have a positive impact on motherhood and female labor supply participation. However, according to the theory, gender norms have a negative impact on motherhood and labor supply participation. Therefore, we decided to conduct the hypothesis test at the level of significance of 0.05. As a result, we reject the H0, which specifies that initially the role of gender norms has an inverse relationship with motherhood and female labor supply participation. The second variable, which is the child effect, 3.887226 is the estimated coefficient for the child effect. So the finding revealed that when the prevalence of childbirths per woman increased by 1%, motherhood and female labor supply participation increased by 3.887226% of the female population aged 15 and above. So it showed that this variable had a positive relationship. However, according to the theory, the presence of children, particularly the first child, appears to have an inverse relationship in which the presence of a child causes a mother to not work. So to confirm, we also conduct the hypothesis test, and the results support the theory that these two variables have a negative effect on each other. So for the third variable, the coefficient of the provision of childcare has a positive value of 2.215266. So it demonstrates that when childcare provision increased by 1% of GDP, motherhood and female labor supply participation increased by 2.215266% of the 15 and older female population. So the OLS estimation results indicates that a positive correlation between childcare provision and motherhood and female labor supply participation. However, after we running the hypothesis test on this variable, we conclude that childcare providers have an inverse relationship with motherhood and female labor supply participation. Last but not least, we assume that about 80% of the differences or variation in motherhood and female labor supply participation can be explained by the differences in these three variables, namely the role of gender norms, the child effect, and the provision of childcare, as these three variables have a significant effect on motherhood and female labor supply participation.
Now, the objective of this study is to investigate the factors that impact the labor force participation rate among females and mothers. Particularly, we find several independent variable or factors, that is child effect, childcare provisions, the role of gender norms, as well as the heterogeneous impact on motherhood. However, we also acknowledge that this study is bound by several limitations. For example, when it comes to data, there are several, because we are doing basically cross-sectional data gathering and not time series. So when it comes to several years, the data is not available. So example, we have two variables that have all data in terms of year 2005, but the other variable doesn't have data in 2005. So how about 2018? You know, some variables also doesn't have the latest data for 2018. So we are bound by that limitations. Hence, even when we are finding the data for 2012, there are still some data that we couldn't obtain. Hence, we have to omit the countries or the samples that doesn't have the data. That is one thing. And another thing is when it comes to heterogeneous impact, it is also one of our key variable, independent variable or factor in affecting the labor participation rate of mother and female. However, due to the nature of that variable or factor to be, I would say, case by case basis or at micro scale, and heterogeneous itself is something that is personalized or individualized case to case basis. Hence, there is no macro level data available for that. Hence, we could not include that in our model and also in the in the regressions for the data analysis. And third, one of the problem also is when it comes to our findings. Yes, we realized that when it comes to our findings, 2/3 of the variables, you know, is not the output of the findings after we run the regression test is not according to the literature, and hence the limitation that we find in our study is due to time constraints and expertise. We could not manage to run a diagnostic test. We do run a regression test, but not a diagnostic test to actually evaluate further, dig deeper of why the findings for our regression for the model that we created is not according to our literature. And last but not least is, of course, recommendations for future studies that were about to be done by this topic is we are hoping a bigger sample size to happen. Now our study is limited to OECD countries, but it would be better to have a bigger sample size beyond OECD countries, perhaps worldwide, with a bigger data sample, etc. And this had been an amazing journey to write about this female and mother participation rate in labor force.